Let me tell you a story about courage in the face of adversity. A story that reveals how deep prejudice can run and how resilience and unity can rise above it. In this narrative, we dive into the lives of Elijah and Sophia Mitchell, two brilliant siblings with hearts full of hope, but forced to navigate the harsh realities of systemic racism in their school. It all starts with an unassuming classroom, a place meant for learning but tainted by bias. What unfolds is a journey of injustice, bravery, and eventual transformation. Before we dive deeper, if this story touches your heart and you believe in the power of standing against injustice, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps share stories like this and amplify voices that matter. Now, let's begin where it all starts, inside the classroom, where hostility hides in plain sight. The first time Elijah and Sophia Mitchell entered the classroom of Mrs. Linda Parker, they felt it a subtle, nearly imperceptible chill. Mrs. Parker was known for her no-nonsense attitude and high standards, but there was something more lurking beneath her polished exterior. Her reputation as a strict teacher preceded her, but it wasn't until she laid eyes on the Mitchell siblings that her demeanor shifted ever so slightly. From the very beginning, Mrs. Parker made it clear that Elijah and Sophia weren't going to get any special treatment. She separated them, placing Elijah at the far right corner of the room and Sophia on the left. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like an innocent arrangement, but to the siblings, it felt deliberate, a calculated move to divide their bond. The whispers among other students didn't help. "Why'd she split them up?" someone asked quietly. "She's never done that before," another added. Elijah, always the optimist, shrugged it off at first. "Maybe she just wants us to focus better," he told his sister during lunch. Sophia wasn't convinced. Her sharp instincts picked up on something more sinister. "No," she replied firmly. "She's testing us." That suspicion was confirmed during their first major math lesson. Mrs. Parker wrote a complex equation on the board, inviting the class to solve it. Hands remained glued to desks until Elijah raised his own. All eyes turned to him. He walked confidently to the board and solved the equation with ease, explaining each step. For a moment, there was a stunned silence in the room. Then Mrs. Parker spoke, her tone clipped and condescending. "Not bad," she said, barely looking at him. "But don't expect to get it right every time. You might get too comfortable." The words stung. Elijah returned to his seat, head held high, but his resolve was tested. Around him, classmates exchanged uneasy glances. A few stifled laughs trickled through the room, not at Elijah, but at the absurdity of the teacher's reaction. He had proven his skill, yet instead of praise, he was met with subtle dismissal. Sophia, watching from her corner of the room, clenched her fists under the desk. She hated seeing her brother undermined like that. It was the first of many moments that would chip away at their confidence and set the tone for what was to come. In the following days, Mrs. Parker's attitude became more apparent. She would call on Elijah or Sophia only when the questions were the hardest, clearly setting them up to fail. Yet, more often than not, they rose to the challenge. Still, the comments persisted, always subtle, always enough to cast doubt. "Careful," she would say to Sophia after a particularly eloquent presentation. "You don't want to overcomplicate things." Or to Elijah after another correct solution. "Let's see how you do on the next one." For the other students, Mrs. Parker's behavior was a spectacle. Some whispered about how she doesn't like those twins. Others avoided getting involved, afraid of becoming targets themselves. A few, like Marcus Wilson, began to quietly sympathize with the siblings, though they didn't yet know how to show support. The true breaking point came during a parent-teacher meeting. Mrs. Parker, speaking to Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, all but suggested that their children might be more suited to focus on extracurriculars rather than aiming for academic rigor. It was a thinly veiled insult, a way of implying they weren't good enough without saying it outright. The Mitchells left the meeting with heavy hearts. but they were determined not to let this injustice define their children's potential. At this stage, the story was far from over. This was just the beginning of a pattern that would escalate into something much more public, much more damaging, and ultimately, much more transformative. What happens when a teacher's quiet prejudices turn into open humiliation? And how did two young siblings rise above the mounting challenges, both inside and outside the classroom? In the next part of this story, the spotlight shifts to Elijah and Sophia's growing resilience, the shocking events that draw the attention of the school administration, and the first spark of change. Stay tuned, because this story only gets deeper from here. The school bell rang, signaling the start of another math lesson. As the students settled into their seats, Mrs. Parker prepared to dive into the topic of the day, trigonometric formulas. The air was heavy with the usual tension that seemed to hang over her classroom, especially for Elijah and Sophia Mitchell. They knew that, sooner or later, they would become the focus of Mrs. Parker's scrutiny. As the lesson progressed, Elijah raised his hand. His question was thoughtful, demonstrating not only that he had understood the material, but also that he was eager to explore its deeper applications. "Excuse me, Mrs. Parker," he began. "Wouldn't this formula also work if we adjusted the angle to account for?" She cut him off mid-sentence. Her tone was laced with sarcasm as she replied, "Elijah, not everyone in this room is as advanced as you seem to think you are. Let's stick to the basics, shall we? Math isn't for everyone after all." The room went silent. Her words, sharp as a blade, hung in the air. Elijah felt the heat of embarrassment creeping up his neck. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, but the weight of her authority silenced him. Across the room, Sophia's jaw tightened. She could feel her brother's humiliation as if it were her own. For the rest of the lesson, Mrs. Parker seemed to take delight in singling Elijah out, challenging him with increasingly difficult questions and dismissing his correct answers with a curt nod or an offhand remark. By the end of the class, Elijah's usual spark was dimmed. As the students filed out of the room, he lingered at his desk, staring at his notebook. The incident didn't go unnoticed. Word spread quickly among the students. Some were sympathetic, whispering about how unfair Mrs. Parker's behavior was. Others found the situation entertaining, laughing at Elijah's expense or sharing exaggerated versions of the story on social media. Sophia decided she'd had enough. That evening, she confided in their parents about what had been happening. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell were furious but not surprised. They had dealt with subtle racism before at work, in their neighborhood, even at the grocery store. But hearing that their children were facing it in school from a teacher was a new low. The next day, things escalated. During a pop quiz, Sophia completed her answers quickly and confidently. As Mrs. Parker collected the papers, she paused at Sophia's desk. "Finished already?" she asked, her voice dripping with doubt. "Let's hope you didn't rush through it. Accuracy is more important than speed, you know." Sophia bit her tongue, refusing to give Mrs. Parker the satisfaction of a reaction. But her silence was misconstrued as submission, emboldening the teacher further. Later, when handing back the graded quizzes, Mrs. Parker made a point of announcing, "Sophia, your work was surprising. Perhaps you're finally paying attention." It was an insult disguised as praise, and everyone in the room knew it. Sophia locked eyes with her brother across the room. The unspoken message was clear. This wasn't going to stop unless they made it stop. But not all eyes in the room were indifferent. During one of Mrs. Parker's tirades, Michael Carter, the school's vice principal, happened to be conducting a routine classroom observation. From the moment he stepped into the room, Mrs. Parker's demeanor shifted. She smiled more, softened her tone, and attempted to engage the students in a lively discussion. It was a stark contrast to her usual behavior, and Carter noticed. He also noticed how Elijah and Sophia seemed hesitant to participate. Their usual confidence was replaced by guarded expressions. Something about the dynamic felt off, and Carter decided to dig deeper. Later that day, Carter called the Mitchell siblings into his office. He asked them directly about their experiences in Mrs. Parker's class. At first, they were reluctant to speak, fearing retaliation. But Carter's genuine concern and reassurance that their voices mattered gave them the courage to share their story. Their account was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Carter listened intently, taking detailed notes and promising to address the issue. For the first time, Elijah and Sophia felt like they had an ally within the school. However, the road ahead was far from easy. Mrs. Parker's behavior was part of a larger pattern, a culture of prejudice that had gone unchecked for years. It wasn't just about one teacher or one classroom. It was about a system that allowed such behavior to persist. As Carter began his investigation, new challenges emerged. A troubling incident involving another student, Brad Walker, would soon shift the focus from Mrs. Parker to the entire school community. But for now, Elijah and Sophia found solace in knowing that someone was finally listening. How does a single teacher's bias reveal the cracks in an entire school system? And what happens when a peer's blatant act of racism forces the student body to confront its own complicity? In the next chapter, the story takes a shocking turn as Elijah and Sophia navigate new challenges, uncover allies, and take their first steps towards standing up against a culture of prejudice. Don't go anywhere. This is just getting started. The story took a dark turn when an online post from Brad Walker, a popular junior at Riverside High, ignited a firestorm. Brad had shared a picture of a prom invitation he'd crafted, intended as a joke, but it was dripping with overt racism. The text mocked a fellow student of color, implying she was lucky to be considered for a white majority event. The caption was worse, littered with slurs disguised as humor. The post spread like wildfire through the school's social media networks. Students whispered and laughed about it in the hallways, their reactions split down the middle. Some dismissed it as a harmless joke, while others, like Elijah and Sophia, felt the sting of its message. It wasn't just the content of the post. It was the silence, or worse, the laughter of those who saw it and did nothing. Sophia was furious. She felt the familiar weight of injustice, that this time, it wasn't just about her and her brother. It was about every student who had ever felt targeted, mocked, or belittled because of their race. "We can't let this slide," she told Elijah. He nodded, sharing her anger but unsure how to channel it. At home that evening, the Mitchell siblings discussed the situation with their parents. Their father, always the calm voice of reason, advised caution. "You're dealing with a lot of people who don't want to see things change," he warned. But their mother encouraged action. "If you don't speak up, who will?" she asked. "This is your chance to make a difference." The next morning, the school felt different. Tension simmered beneath the surface as students navigated the fallout from Brad's post. A few brave souls, like Marcus Wilson, voiced their disapproval. Marcus had seen too many of his peers ignore or excuse racism, and he was determined to stand with Elijah and Sophia. "This isn't just a joke," he told his friends during lunch. "It's a symptom of something bigger." But not everyone agreed. Brad's supporters, emboldened by his popularity, dismissed the criticism as overreaction. "It's just a prom invite," one of them said. "People need to lighten up." These comments deepened the divide within the student body, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and unease. Sophia decided to take action. As a member of the school's anti-racism committee, she called an emergency meeting. The group, made up of a small but passionate mix of students from diverse backgrounds, gathered in a quiet corner of the library. Sophia explained the situation, laying out not just what had happened, but why it mattered. "This isn't just about one post," she said. "It's about a culture that allows things like this to happen. It's about students like Brad thinking they can say whatever they want without consequences. And it's about us, about whether we're willing to stand up and say, 'This isn't okay.'" The room was silent for a moment, then filled with murmurs of agreement. One by one, the students shared their own experiences with racism at Riverside High. Some recounted being overlooked in class. Others spoke about subtle slights from teachers or classmates, and a few admitted they had stayed silent in the past, afraid to rock the boat. The committee decided to respond publicly. They drafted a statement condemning Brad's post and calling on the school administration to take a firm stand against racism. They also planned an educational campaign to raise awareness among their peers. "This is just the beginning," Sophia said as the meeting wrapped up. "We're not letting this die down." Meanwhile, Vice Principal Carter was working behind the scenes. He had received several complaints about the post and was under pressure to address it. Carter knew this wasn't just about Brad. It was about the systemic issues that had been festering at Riverside High for years. He began meeting with teachers, students, and parents, trying to understand the scope of the problem and build a case for meaningful change. But not everyone was on board. Some teachers dismissed the controversy as a distraction, and a vocal group of parents argued that the school was overreacting. "Kids will be kids," one parent said during a heated meeting. "Why ruin Brad's future over a joke?" Carter pushed back. "This isn't just about one student," he said firmly. "It's about creating a safe and inclusive environment for everyone. If we don't address this now, we're sending a message that this behavior is acceptable." As the committee's efforts gained momentum, Sophia and Elijah began to see the ripple effects. More students started speaking out, sharing their own stories on social media and joining the call for change. Marcus, inspired by Sophia's leadership, took to Instagram to share a heartfelt post about his experiences as a Black student at Riverside High. His words resonated with many, sparking a wave of solidarity. But the backlash was just as fierce. Brad's supporters doubled down, spreading rumors about Sophia and Elijah and accusing them of seeking attention. The siblings knew they were fighting an uphill battle, but they refused to back down. The conflict reached its peak when the Anti-Racism Committee organized a school-wide assembly to address the issue. They invited guest speakers, shared personal stories, and presented a list of demands to the administration. Among the demands were mandatory diversity training for staff and students, a zero-tolerance policy for hate speech, and increased support for minority students. The assembly was a turning point. It forced the entire school community to confront its own biases and reflect on the kind of environment they wanted to create. For Sophia and Elijah, it was a moment of both triumph and exhaustion. They had taken a stand, but the fight was far from over. What happens when students take a stand against an ingrained system of prejudice? And how do the forces of resistance from peers to parents react when the status quo is challenged? In the next chapter, we'll see how Sophia and Elijah lead their peers in a bold protest, face down the school administration, and ignite a movement that no one can ignore. Stay with us, this story is just heating up. The decision to organize a school-wide protest didn't come easily. Sophia and Elijah knew the risks. They'd already faced ridicule, backlash, and attempts to silence their voices. But they also knew that their efforts were gaining traction. The assembly had sparked conversations, but change wasn't coming fast enough. It was time for action, something big and visible that the administration couldn't ignore. It started in the library, during another meeting of the Anti-Racism Committee. Sophia outlined her plan, her voice steady and confident despite the tension in the room. "We've tried talking," she said, looking around at her peers. "We've tried raising awareness, but it's clear that some people aren't listening. A protest will show them we're serious." The group nodded in agreement, though there was an undercurrent of nervous energy. Marcus raised his hand. "What if the administration shuts it down?" he asked. "What if they suspend us?" Sophia didn't flinch. "Then they'll prove our point," she replied. "This isn't just about us. It's about every student who's ever felt silenced or excluded. If we don't take a stand, who will?" With that, the plan began to take shape. The protest would be peaceful but powerful, a march through the school's hallways, culminating in a rally on the front lawn. Students would carry signs with messages like "Stop Racism" and "Unity for All." They would wear black to symbolize solidarity and used the event to present their demands once again to the administration. In the days leading up to the protest, the committee worked tirelessly. Sophia coordinated logistics, while Elijah and Marcus focused on spreading the word. They created flyers, posted on social media, and reached out to students one-on-one, encouraging them to join. Some were hesitant, worried about the consequences, but many more were eager to participate. The morning of the protest arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. As students trickled into the school, it became clear that the event was going to be bigger than anyone had anticipated. Dozens of students wore black, their faces a mixture of determination and apprehension. The Mitchell siblings stood at the front of the group, their presence a steadying force. At precisely 10 a.m., the march began. The students moved as one, their footsteps echoing through the hallways. Teachers and staff looked on in stunned silence, some supportive, others disapproving. The signs held high in the air carried messages that were impossible to ignore. Equality now. No place for hate. Listen to us. The march reached its climax on the school's front lawn, where the students gathered in a large circle. Sophia stepped forward, holding a megaphone. Her voice was strong, cutting through the crisp morning air. "We are here today because enough is enough," she began. "For too long, racism has been ignored, tolerated, and dismissed in this school. Today, we say no more." The crowd erupted into applause, and Sophia continued, laying out the committee's demands once again. "We're calling for mandatory diversity training, a zero-tolerance policy for hate speech, and better support for minority students," she said. "These are not requests. These are necessities." As Sophia spoke, the school's principal, Margaret Benson, arrived on the scene. Her face was a mask of controlled frustration as she approached the students. "This demonstration is unauthorized," she began, her voice firm. "I need you all to return to your classrooms immediately." Sophia didn't back down. "We'll return to our classrooms when you agree to meet our demands," she said, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just about us. It's about making this school a place where everyone feels safe and valued." Benson's eyes darted to the crowd. It was clear that she was outnumbered, and the last thing she wanted was a confrontation that could escalate further. "I'll arrange a meeting with the committee this afternoon," she said finally. "But for now, this protest needs to end." Sophia hesitated, weighing her options. She knew they had made their point, but she also didn't want to lose momentum. After a brief, whispered discussion with the other committee members, she addressed the crowd again. "We'll return to class for now," she said, "but this isn't over. We'll hold you to your promise, Principal Benson." The students dispersed, their spirits high despite the principal's attempt to shut them down. The protest had sent a clear message. They wouldn't be silenced. For Elijah and Sophia, it was a moment of triumph, but they also knew it was just one battle in a much larger war. As the day went on, the effects of the protest rippled through the school. Teachers who had previously stayed silent began speaking out in support of the students. Parents called the administration, some to complain, others to applaud the initiative. Social media buzzed with photos and videos of the march, spreading the message far beyond the walls of Riverside High. But not everyone was on their side. Brad Walker and his supporters were vocal in their criticism, calling the protest pointless and accusing the Mitchell siblings of seeking attention. Principal Benson, while agreeing to meet with the committee, remained non-committal about implementing their demands. Elijah and Sophia knew the fight wasn't over. The protest was a step forward, but it was also a reminder of how deeply ingrained the issues were. Still, they remained hopeful, buoyed by the support of their peers and the growing momentum of their movement. What happens when the administration is forced to confront its own complicity in perpetuating systemic bias? And how will Elijah and Sophia handle the growing pressure from both allies and opponents as their movement gains traction? In the next chapter, the focus shifts to a tense showdown between the Anti-Racism Committee and the school's leadership, as well as the personal toll of leading a revolution. Don't miss what's coming next. This story is far from over. As the protest reverberated through Riverside High, its ripple effects reached every corner of the school, including the classroom of Mrs. Linda Parker. She had watched the events unfold from the safety of her window, her face betraying little emotion. But inside, she felt the weight of it all. The Mitchell siblings, who she'd quietly undermined for months, were now at the center of a growing movement for change, and their defiance cast a glaring spotlight on her own actions. In the days following the protest, Mrs. Parker's demeanor shifted, but not for the better. She became more guarded, her comments more calculated. Gone were the overt digs and dismissive remarks. In their place was an icy professionalism that felt just as alienating. For Elijah and Sophia, the change was no relief. It was simply another mask for the same prejudice. The tension came to a head during a classroom debate about historical inequalities. As usual, Mrs. Parker tried to control the discussion, steering it away from topics that might highlight systemic racism. But the students, emboldened by the recent protest, pushed back. Marcus Wilson raised his hand. "Why are we avoiding the real issue?" he asked. "If we're talking about history, we can't ignore racism. It's still happening right here in this school." The room fell silent. Mrs. Parker's lips tightened as she replied, "Marcus, this discussion is about historical events. Let's not make it personal." But Sophia, seated near the back, wasn't about to let the moment pass. She raised her hand and spoke with calm determination. "It is personal, Mrs. Parker. History shapes the present, and ignoring it doesn't make it go away." The atmosphere was electric. Students exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others watching nervously as the standoff unfolded. Mrs. Parker's composure cracked for a moment, her voice rising as she responded. "Sophia, this is my classroom, and I decide what's appropriate for discussion." Sophia didn't flinch. "And this is my education," she said. "We deserve to talk about things that matter." The exchange was interrupted by Vice Principal Michael Carter, who happened to walk in at that moment for another observation. He stood quietly at the back of the room, taking in the scene. Mrs. Parker, noticing his presence, quickly pivoted, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Let's move on," she said curtly, turning to write on the board. But the damage was done. The students, inspired by Sophia's courage, began murmuring among themselves. Carter watched closely, his expression unreadable. After class, he asked to speak with Mrs. Parker privately. Their conversation was brief but pointed. Carter addressed the growing complaints about her behavior, reminding her that Riverside High was under scrutiny after the protest. "We can't afford to ignore these issues," he said. "Your classroom needs to be a space where every student feels respected." Mrs. Parker bristled at the implication but nodded stiffly. "Of course," she replied. "I'll ensure that happens." However, the confrontation didn't stop her from making another critical misstep. During a parent-teacher conference, she suggested to the Mitchells that Elijah might benefit from simple coursework to build his confidence. The comment, delivered with a thin veneer of concern, infuriated Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell. They immediately filed a formal complaint, citing a pattern of discriminatory behavior. Carter, already aware of the ongoing issues, decided it was time for decisive action. He called a meeting with Principal Benson and presented his findings. Multiple reports of bias, student testimonies, and now a formal complaint from the Mitchells. "This isn't an isolated incident," Carter said firmly. "Mrs. Parker's actions are part of a larger problem, and it's time we address it." Reluctantly, Benson agreed to place Mrs. Parker on probation. She was required to attend sensitivity training and submit to regular classroom evaluations. But the measures felt insufficient to the Mitchells and their supporters. "This isn't about fixing one teacher," Sophia said during another committee meeting. "It's about changing the whole system." Despite the probation, Mrs. Parker's behavior didn't truly change. Her training sessions seemed to go in one ear and out the other, and her attitude remained defiant. "I've been teaching for 20 years, she told a colleague one afternoon. I know how to handle my classroom. These kids just don't understand discipline. Her downfall came during a school assembly, where she made an offhand comment to a group of parents about the challenges of teaching students who aren't prepared. The remark, though vague, was widely interpreted as another dig at minority students. Word spread quickly, and Carter received yet another complaint. This time, he didn't hold back. Mrs. Parker was called into a meeting with the administration and informed that her contract would not be renewed. The decision, while controversial, sent a clear message. The school was finally beginning to take accountability. For Elijah and Sophia, the news was bittersweet. On one hand, they were relieved to see a measure of justice. But on the other, they knew Mrs. Parker's removal was just the tip of the iceberg. There were still systemic issues to address, and the fight was far from over. How do you confront a system that resists change at every turn? As the Mitchell siblings and their allies navigate the fallout from Mrs. Parker's departure, they face new challenges from peers, parents, and even other teachers. In the next chapter, we'll see how their movement grows beyond the walls of the school, inspiring broader conversations about equality and sparking a debate that the entire community can't ignore. Stay tuned. The story is only gaining momentum. Mrs. Parker's dismissal sent shockwaves through Riverside High. Some saw it as a long overdue victory, a sign that the school was finally addressing its deep-rooted issues. Others, however, viewed it as an overreach, a dangerous precedent that placed students and parents in control of the school's authority. The divide exposed the fault lines within the community, and for Elijah and Sophia, it was clear their fight was far from over. The pushback began almost immediately. A group of parents, many of whom had previously dismissed concerns about racism as exaggerations, organized a meeting to voice their opposition. They argued that Mrs. Parker's dismissal was a knee-jerk reaction to student complaints and accused the administration of bowing to public pressure. "What message are we sending to our teachers?" one parent asked angrily. "That their authority means nothing?" Principal Margaret Benson found herself caught in the middle. The protest and Mrs. Parker's actions had put the school under intense scrutiny from both the district and the public. Benson understood the need for change, but struggled to balance the demands of progressive students like Sophia and Elijah with the concerns of more conservative parents and staff. Meanwhile, resistance was brewing among the teachers as well. Some colleagues of Mrs. Parker openly criticized the decision to let her go. "This isn't about racism," one teacher said in the break room. "It's about kids who don't want to be held accountable. They're just using this as an excuse." These attitudes didn't surprise Elijah and Sophia, but they were a stark reminder of the uphill battle they faced. Even as their movement gained traction, it was clear that change would require more than removing one problematic teacher. It would take systemic reform, and that meant challenging power structures that have been in place for decades. In response to the growing backlash, Vice Principal Carter decided to double down on his support for the students. He organized a series of listening sessions, inviting students, parents, and staff to share their perspectives. The sessions were tense and emotional, but they also revealed the depth of the problem. Stories poured in from students of color who described feeling overlooked, underestimated, or outright targeted by teachers and peers. One student, a quiet sophomore named Maya, broke down as she recounted an incident where a teacher dismissed her concerns about being bullied for her accent. "These aren't isolated incidents," Carter said during a meeting with the school board. "They're part of a pattern. If we don't address this now, we're failing our students." But not everyone agreed. During one of the listening sessions, Brad Walker's mother stood up and accused the administration of creating a hostile environment for students like her son. "My child feels like he's being punished for something he didn't do," she said, her voice quivering with indignation. "This school is supposed to be a place for learning, not activism." Sophia couldn't stay silent. "With all due respect," she said, her voice steady but firm, "this isn't about punishing anyone. It's about making sure everyone feels safe and valued. That includes your son, but it also includes people like me and my brother." The room fell silent. For a moment, it seemed like the weight of Sophia's words might shift the tone of the discussion, but the division ran too deep. As the meeting continued, it became clear that resistance to change wasn't just about ignorance or indifference. It was about fear. Fear of losing power, fear of admitting complicity, and fear of confronting uncomfortable truths. Despite the challenges, Elijah and Sophia refused to back down. They threw themselves into their roles as leaders, working tirelessly to build bridges where they could and push for accountability where they couldn't. Sophia took the lead on organizing community forums, inviting local activists and educators to speak about the importance of diversity and inclusion. Elijah focused on mentoring younger students, using his own experiences to help them navigate the challenges of being a minority in a predominantly white school. Their efforts began to pay off. Slowly but surely, more students and teachers started to join their cause. Marcus Wilson became a key ally, using his charisma and social media presence to amplify their message. Even some of the parents who had initially been skeptical started to come around, moved by the stories of students like Maya and inspired by the Mitchell siblings' unwavering determination. One of the most powerful moments came when the students collaborated to create a mural in the school's main hallway. The mural, designed by Elijah and painted by a group of volunteers, depicted a vibrant scene of unity and diversity. At the center was a quote, "Our differences are our strength." The mural became a symbol of the movement, a daily reminder of what they were fighting for. But the resistance didn't disappear. Conservative parents continued to push back, accusing the school of prioritizing politics over education. Some students, emboldened by their parents' attitudes, began targeting Elijah and Sophia with subtle acts of harassment, snide comments in the hallways, anonymous notes in their lockers. It was a painful reminder that progress was never linear. For Sophia, the hardest part was the toll it took on her relationships. She found herself drifting away from friends who didn't understand or didn't care about what she was fighting for. Even her bond with Elijah was tested as the pressure mounted. "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it," she admitted one evening. "It feels like no matter what we do, people will always find a way to tear us down." Elijah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's worth it," he said. "If we don't do this, who will?" Their determination kept them going, but they knew they couldn't do it alone. The next step was clear. They needed to take their fight beyond the walls of Riverside High. If the school administration wouldn't implement meaningful changes, they would turn to the district and the community at large to demand accountability. What happens when a school's battle for equality spills into the wider community? And how do Sophia and Elijah handle the mounting pressure as their movement gains momentum? In the next chapter, we'll see how the Mitchell siblings take their fight to the next level, forging new alliances and confronting new challenges in their quest for lasting change. Stay with us. This story is far from over. As the Mitchell siblings expanded their movement beyond Riverside High, the challenges multiplied, but so did their victories. The school district, under increasing public pressure, agreed to hold a town hall meeting to address the issues raised by the students. The event drew a crowd far larger than anyone had anticipated. Parents, teachers, students, and community members packed into the auditorium, eager to hear what the district would say and to see how Elijah and Sophia would respond. The town hall began with remarks from Superintendent Jane Ellis, who outlined the district's commitment to creating an inclusive environment. But her words felt hollow to many in the audience, including Elijah and Sophia. "We're aware of the concerns," Ellis said, "and we're taking steps to address them." Sophia wasn't satisfied. When the floor opened for public comments, she approached the microphone with the calm resolve of someone who had prepared for this moment her entire life. "With all due respect, Superintendent Ellis," she began, "awareness isn't enough. We've been aware of these issues for years. What we need is action." She proceeded to outline the demands once more: mandatory diversity training, clear consequences for discriminatory behavior, increased representation of minority voices in school leadership, and better support systems for students of color. Her words were met with applause from many in the audience, but not everyone was on her side. A group of parents in the back murmured among themselves, their disapproval palpable. Elijah followed his sister, sharing a personal story about how racism had affected his confidence and sense of belonging. "I used to love coming to school," he said, "but there were days I didn't even want to get out of bed because I knew I'd have to face people who didn't believe in me, not because of what I'd done, but because of what I look like." His vulnerability struck a chord. Even some of the skeptics in the room began to see the depth of the problem. But the siblings knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to create lasting change. They needed a plan and allies. The weeks that followed the town hall were a whirlwind of activity. The district formed a task force on diversity and inclusion, and Sophia was invited to join as a student representative. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the committee's recommendations went beyond lip service. "We can't just check boxes," she told the group during their first meeting. "We need policies with real teeth." Elijah, meanwhile, focused on building grassroots support. He partnered with local organizations to host workshops and community forums, inviting experts to speak about systemic racism and the importance of equity in education. These events not only educated the public, but also galvanized a growing coalition of supporters. One of the most powerful moments came during a district-wide student assembly organized by the Anti-Racism Committee. Elijah and Sophia took the stage together, their unity a symbol of strength and resilience. They shared their journey, from the subtle biases they faced in Mrs. Parker's classroom to the protest that had sparked a movement. By the time they finished, the audience was on its feet, giving them a standing ovation. But the road to change wasn't without setbacks. Some schools resisted implementing the new policies, citing budget constraints or logistical challenges. Teachers who had been quietly complicit in the past struggled to adapt to the new expectations. And the backlash from conservative parents continued, with some accusing the district of pushing an agenda. Despite these obstacles, progress was undeniable. Riverside High implemented mandatory diversity training for all staff, created a mentorship program for students of color, and established a zero-tolerance policy for hate speech. The Mitchell siblings' efforts had sparked a cultural shift, not just in their school, but throughout the district. One of the most symbolic victories came when Elijah and Sophia led a team to compete in the National Math League Championship. After months of grueling preparation, they emerged as champions, bringing recognition to Riverside High and proving once again that their potential was limitless. The win was more than just a trophy. It was a testament to their resilience and determination to rise above the challenges they faced. For Sophia, the journey had changed her forever. She found her calling as an advocate for social justice and began considering a career in law or public policy. Elijah, ever the problem solver, dreamed of becoming an engineer who could use his skills to bridge divides and create opportunities for others. Together, they inspired countless others to believe in the power of persistence and unity. Even Mrs. Parker's story took an unexpected turn. After her dismissal, she spent months in quiet reflection, volunteering at a community center where she worked with underprivileged youth. Slowly, she began to understand the harm she had caused and the biases she had carried. Though redemption didn't come easily, she dedicated herself to making amends, one small step at a time. The impact of the Mitchell siblings' movement was felt long after they graduated. The policies they had fought for became the foundation for a more inclusive school culture, and their story continued to inspire future generations of students to stand up for what was right. This story is a powerful reminder that change doesn't come easily, but it's always worth fighting for. Elijah and Sophia Mitchell started as two students facing adversity, but their courage and resilience sparked a movement that transformed an entire community. If their story moved you, take a moment to reflect on how you can make a difference in your own community. And if you haven't already, Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories of triumph, resilience, and the fight for justice. Together, we can create a world where everyone is valued and respected. And don't stop here. Check out our other videos for more inspiring stories and thought-provoking discussions. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.